Welcome to Of Mics and Memory Cards, a complete rundown of the PlayStation 1 game library, all 4,105 of them. My name is Tyler, and today I am joined by...
the genetic experiment, formerly known as Jacob.
And again, I'm just Kameron. It's just me.
And that's enough, because this game is about embracing your true self and acknowledging the identity of who you really are as a person. So Kameron, I'm here to tell you, you're enough.
I'm Cam, and I can't make it with the Ken off, but that's fine. I'm enough.
Today we are talking about Final Fantasy VII. You know it, you love it, or you might hate it. I'm not sure. Let's talk about it some more. I think maybe first thing to do would be to go through our histories with the Final Fantasy series. So let's pick our first FF, our favorite FF, and then our least favorite FF. You want to cue us off, Jacob?
Yeah, so appropriately enough, my very first Final Fantasy game was Final Fantasy VII. When it comes to Final Fantasy VII, it was I think maybe the first game I had on the original PlayStation. And when I popped it in, I would play, you get the opening, you see Eris, you get the train coming in, Cloud somersaults off of it. It's so rad. It's so cool. You're making your way to the Mako reactor, and ultimately you get to that Scorpion boss, that Scorpion machine at the end of it. And I thought in my 7 to 8 year old brain, wow, this game is great. This is a really tough final boss, and I couldn't beat it. For years, I could not beat it. It wasn't until high school, around the same time that I was going over to that young preacher's apartment where we were playing Tekken Tag Tournament, that I was like, you know what? I'm going to play Final Fantasy. I'm going to give it a real try this time. But I didn't have a PlayStation 1 memory card for my PS2 anymore. But I really wanted to play it. So I popped it in. I got past that Scorpion, which felt like a nearly 10-year-long challenge I'd finally overcome, and I kept playing all the way, as far as I could, but I didn't save. So I was playing this game without a net, right? Operating without a net. If I died, the game would start over. And I made it all the way to Shinra Corporation after President Shinra has died, and I'm fighting Rufus out on the rooftop with the helicopter in the background, and that's where I finally died. After my entire party had left, it was just Cloud and him. It was brutal.
Aww.
And I, at that point though, had fallen so deeply in love with the game that I just started it back up again. Like any other save where it's you die, you pick back up where you left off, and I kept playing, but this time I got a PlayStation 1 card from the local GameStop or wherever, and was able to play the game all the way to completion. So Final Fantasy VII, first and favorite, easily. What about you guys?
Do demos count? Do on the PlayStation demo discs, do those count, or just
Yeah, demos definitely count.
Sure, why not?
Okay, so then technically my very first Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy VIII, with the demo that came from the old demo disc that had a selection of 5 games. And so that was my very actual first taste of Final Fantasy. And it's weird because that version of Final Fantasy VIII, it just drops you in, for those who haven't played it, there's a section of the game. This isn't quite the beginning, but there's a section of the game where it drops you off on an island to take down some kind of satellite dish or some kind of weapon there, and you play as the main character Squall, Zell, and Rinoa, which is interesting because Rinoa is not available at this part of the actual game. You get Selphie in the actual game because she's the new recruit that joins your party at the last minute before this mission starts. So that was my first experience, and I think that also has a giant spider robot chasing you in that section, which is funny because Jacob has a giant robot Final Fantasy story.
Right.
So that would be my first one. My favorite is actually Final Fantasy X, and I think that is tied to that one being my first Final Fantasy game that I've actually owned and played through for the first time. And back then it was the first Final Fantasy with voice acting, whether or not you think the voice acting was good. Exactly. I knew as soon as I said Final Fantasy, someone was going to do the Titus laugh.
I think that scene is very sweet and misinterpreted. They are laughing in the face of death, which hurts. It's supposed to be forced and awkward. I don't think people are too mean on that scene. I think it's actually very well done.
It is, yes. But not only that, it's I know the whole game says, oh, this is Titus's story, but it's actually Yuna's story. Yuna is the protagonist of those games. So that would be my favorite. I think it's purely nostalgia, but I can play Final Fantasy X over and over and over. So yeah, easily my favorite FF.
I love Final Fantasy X. I also love that Titus wears like a one leg pant, one leg shorts. I wanted that look to take off, and it never did. I don't know if it's Generation Alpha that's going to bring that look, but I cannot wait.
I had
for
those
it.
like cargo pants where you could like zip at the knees and then make them cargo shorts. So I would unzip one of them just so I had one long pant and one short.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
When you first did that, it put you on a trajectory to becoming my friend.
Little
That
did I know.
moment to the day we met was cosmically connected.
I don't recall offhand if 10 are Nomura designs, but I feel like Gen Alpha is going to be the Tetsuya Nomura generation. I think they will wear exactly
I think
the shit
10
that he
is
designs.
Nomura. I think it is a Nomura design.
Better late than never.
There's so many zippers, it's got to be Nomura.
And belts for Lulu.
My first Final Fantasy I was a latecomer to the series. My first was 10, which I played at a friend's house. I previously hadn't had any real interest in RPGs. I had played Super Mario RPG, did not know what the letters stood for. I was just like, this game is weird. I rented it a few times. I kind of enjoy this, but I don't really understand what's happening. And then I played 10, and it just blew my little mind. But then I had only played it at that friend's house. All I owned was a Super Nintendo at the time. So then I went back, and the first one I finished was Final Fantasy VI, which I thought was Final Fantasy III. We can get into that later. And for a long time, I would have said that 6 was my favorite. I did eventually get 10 on the PS2 and played through it at the time. But I finally went back to 10 with the PS4 remaster, I think earlier last year, and was just enamored with it. To me, that game is about as close to perfection as you can get. So for a long time, I always said 6. I now say 10 after that most recent replay. So I don't think it's just nostalgia with 10. I think there is just something so well crafted about that story. It's just so gorgeous, so expertly done, so not in need of any sort of sequel. We can get into that some other time too. I played through 10-2 on the remaster as well, like right after. It's fine. It's fine.
I think what you're forgetting here, Tyler, is wasn't that the last game you played before you became a married man?
It was.
That's
I
right.
just finished FF 10-2, I think a couple days before I got married. So that was the last game I played as a quote-unquote single man who had been with the same person for 10 years.
YRP in position.
I will go to bat defending 10-2 because that game, it's not very often that you get to play dress up in a game that's as dynamic and fun as Final Fantasy X-2 and with total
and it's
babes
actually a
too.
crucial mechanic to the game.
It's so important. You have to be good at it. It kind of reminds me, my wife was stunned because there was a phone game called Love Nikki. I don't know if you guys have heard of this game, but it's a dress-up game, and it is addictive. And I had it on my phone and had been playing it for like 3 months, but like kept it entirely to myself. I was like, I don't want anyone to know that I'm playing this game. It's very fun, but I just am not going to be open about that. And finally, my wife downloads it and is loving it. And she's like, Jacob, you've got to take a look at this game. And I'm all like, actually, I haven't beaten it, but I have done everything.
I'm quite the expert.
Yeah, I'm quite the expert. I've done everything you can do without having to pay more money. I do want to say real quickly, I think as far as the worst Final Fantasy game, or least favorite, we can't not go there. And I'm torn. I'll be honest with you. This might be like an unfair choice. I think mine might be Final Fantasy, like the first one.
Oh, that's fair. I think that's fair.
Interesting.
I tried to get into it, and I appreciate it. It does sort of set the parameters for, I think people sometimes think of, say, Tolkien as it's all like, hey, like a fantasy world is this sort of like generic Tolkien world. And it does a disservice to the actual like effort that man put into creating Middle Earth. But Final Fantasy is very much like textbook fantasy where it's bare bones. We're not doing much with it, and it's really hard. Whereas I think so many, I haven't played every one, but every one that I have played feels specific, and like it's attempting to do something, and this is just like a template upon which everything else, I guess, arises from. So personally, I might say one, I am also partial to a criticism of 13, but I'll let Kameron take over for your least favorite.
It's funny. My least favorite is actually Final Fantasy II, like the original 2, with Firion as the protagonist, just because of its incredibly broken leveling up system, and it just doesn't make sense. And like I hear the story's fine, but it just feels like such a slog to get through because of how you have to level up your characters. That's pretty much all I have to say about it. I didn't get very far. It actually made me mad playing the game, so that's why it's my least favorite.
Totally fair.
Did both of you try playing the original NES versions, or were you trying to play re-releases?
I played the original NES version.
Yeah, I played the Dawn of Souls version for the Game Boy Advance for both of those, but I do understand where Jacob's coming from, because the original NES version of the original Final Fantasy is pretty bad. Like, I just remember running into this issue, like when you're targeting an enemy and kill it, but then you have your next party member also was targeting that enemy, and that enemy is already dead. It'll just hit air. Like, you have to plan ahead and just hope.
Take your time.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, I just miss being able to be like, common sense. Oh, that enemy's not there anymore. I'm gonna hit the next one.
I think that was pretty common at the time. I think Dragon Quest 2 or 3 did that as well, so I feel like that was kind of in the air. I will admit that, one is definitely busted. There's, I believe, some items and magic spells in it that don't work as intended, so as far as the programming goes, they're pretty busted. And 2 on the NES is certainly a slog. I played both via Dawn of Souls as well. And when I give my least favorite answer, some of it is maybe me liking to be contradictory and make people mad, but I despise Final Fantasy VIII. I think I
knew this was coming. I knew this was coming.
And I know it's going to piss people off, because I do think there's folks who swear by that game, and I will admit I haven't played it in 15 years. I think I tried playing it in college, but I remember just every step of the way I was just so mad. I was like, why are they doing this way? It's so counterintuitive, and I know it does a lot of things to break standardization, like specifically to be different and approach the JRPG in a different way, but I find that so many of the swings they take, they're big swings, so they're big misses. But again, that was my experience at the time. I'd be interested to go back now, but to put in perspective, I would take 13 over 8 any day.
Damn.
Oh wow. Would you guys, my wife and I were having this conversation the other day where it's like, what are like generally considered like the top tier like Final Fantasy games? And I know that 6 and 7 would be on there.
I think 9 is
10 and 12. Would there be any others included in that?
I would put Final Fantasy IV in there.
And I think if you were from Japan, you'd put 5. I think 5 is really popular in the Japanese market, and I think not as popular over here just because of the nature of the way it was released, which was, I think the first version of 5 we got was for the PlayStation, and it was one of those first translated RPGs that was circling around the internet circle in like, I think the late 90s maybe, one of the first like big fan translations, so it's always felt like a bit of an underground hit over here, but I feel like 5 is generally considered one of the better as far as gameplay goes on the SNES. So really, like, everything from 4 to 12, if you overlook 8 and 11, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel
All
like
right.
that's
Yeah.
a strong golden Final Fantasy
Waiting
era.
for it to come back. Waiting for the Final Fantasy Renaissance.
Haven't played 16. I
haven't
want
either.
to have played every other main line except the MMOs, so I feel like I've got to.
Yeah, same.
I think with all that said, we should jump in. Let's throw one thing in there just as a precaution. If anyone listening has not played Final Fantasy VII, we're going to go in depth on the spoilers. The big spoiler, if you have ever read a gaming article, you probably know already, but there are, if you are going in completely blind, I would genuinely say to stop listening, go play Final Fantasy VII, and then come back. I do think it's still worth it, but we are going to go in depth on the story and the moments of shock contained therein. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so.
I agree. Yeah.
Without further ado, we begin this first part of a potentially multi-part podcast series, and we will start with the history of Final Fantasy VII. Buckle up, everybody.
Da, 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 da.
We need a panning shot through space before we start. Whoosh. Where to start with Final Fantasy VII, perhaps one of the biggest gaming releases of all time, a system seller, an industry changer, a genre definer, a showcase of what a new era of polygonal graphics would do to change storytelling and the artistic medium of interactive media forever. It's a story of developers at the absolute peak of their prowess, and of a console firmly placing its flag as the victor of a war that it hadn't even been competing in a few years prior. But aside from all of that, Final Fantasy VII is just a damn good game. One that I and others still come back to time and time again, despite advances in graphical fidelity and gameplay. It's a game that feels important, from slap fights to giant mecha, magic systems and amnesiacs, aliens, snowboarding, vampires, ninjas, big bird racing, and the power of losing the person that you care about the most. Final Fantasy VII dreams big and demands that you come along for the ride and hold on tight. I'm not gonna lie, when I mentioned the losing the person you care about the most, I got a little misty-eyed, because it's such a special moment. I don't know, it's hard to explain.
It is probably one of the first games that's made me feel something like that brought out a real emotional response out of me. Like, up until that point, I didn't know video games could do that for you. Like, I had a bit of that with 10. Like, I definitely felt something with 10, but 7.
Oh, 10 made me
did
cry
it more.
at the end.
I cry more with 10 now than I did when I was younger playing it. But it definitely made me feel things.
I really think that the power of a video game to make death last it's beyond, right? It breaks the boundaries of what a game is. Inherent to the idea of video gaming is that you get to respawn. And so treating death as permanent, I can imagine that if Final Fantasy VII had actually come out, like if the remake was coming out fresh, it wasn't a remake, it was like the original, people would lose their minds over the character death in Final Fantasy VII the way that they did for Joel in The Last of Us Part 2. So,
man, can you imagine all the think pieces and the ideas and the fact that it would have come out like, it would have leaked a month early and everything would have been spoiled and we would have seen on Kotaku, Aerith dies.
I'm glad that it did not, it's not a new fresh idea now. I'm glad it came out when it did.
You don't want to read all the think pieces, Cameron, about how Aerith dying is it's fridging the woman in order for Cloud's development to actually like amount to something.
And we'll get into it with the narrative here, but the way that they treated that death was very intentionally designed to be different than the Final Fantasy deaths that had come before. The most of which I think you saw in 4, but it was all martyrdom-style deaths. It was, I think it's Palom and Parom, encase themselves in stone. And there's a bunch of fake deaths, like Sid dies, but he doesn't die. Does anyone in 4 actually die?
I think if I could be wrong. Yeah, I could be wrong. But I think in the original version of 4, those character deaths were permanent. But then in the re-releases, like the Game Boy Advance re-releases and like anything after that, they changed, like they added like scenes later to show that, they're actually fine. So I could be wrong, but I don't think...
I actually played 4 again last year, and the original SNES English translation, which I had never played before. And no, they came back.
Oh, okay. So
the only person I think who stayed dead was Tella.
Oh, God, Tella.
Well, and 4's got a messy-ass chronology because of the After Years, which I also played. And, oh, look, if we're talking the real worst Final Fantasy games, it is Final Fantasy IV, the After Years. That is the biggest piece of dog shit I have ever had the misfortune to play through. But we're besides ourselves here. Final Fantasy VII was developed by Squaresoft, and before we get to anything else, let's start by identifying the 4 main characters of our development story.
This is our party that we're going into combat with.
Yes, exactly. We should figure out what class each of them is, either at the end of it as we go along.
100%.
So the party leader is Hironobu Sakaguchi. He's the producer of Final Fantasy VII and the father of the series as a whole. Sakaguchi directed the first 5 Final Fantasy games and would serve as supervisor for most of the Squaresoft RPG's output up through Final Fantasy X-2.
Leaving on a high note, baby.
I think he's probably your standard fighter.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's the leader guy. He's an all-rounder. Next is Yoshinori Kitase. He's a director hot off the heels of directing Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. Kitase would also go on to direct Final Fantasy VIII and X, so the best and worst. Sorry, the worst and best, respectively. He's also credited as the lead writer of Final Fantasy VII. There's our boy, Tetsuya Nomura. He's the character and visual designer. Nomura's designs, love him or hate him, are undeniably iconic. Nomura had somewhat limited experience with the series prior to 7 and served as a graphical or field designer, but has since become sort of a figurehead of 7 and just following the original game. He is one of the few staff to be involved with the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, which are all of the 7 specific sequels. We'll get into what that means later. Nomura is also the head of the Kingdom Hearts series. So if he's particularly big or if you've heard his name before, it's probably from that. And then the 4th party member, who's definitely the bard here, is Nobuo Uematsu. Is that how you guys pronounce it?
Yeah.
He is the GOAT game composer. Uematsu was with Final Fantasy from the start up until 10. He didn't do all of 10's soundtrack. I think he did about half of it. And he is the sole writer of Final Fantasy VII's music and is God. There are many other folks who helped build Final Fantasy VII. Anywhere between 150 to 350 staff members. It's a little tough to find the exact. But much of the iconic design, story, music, and mechanics are spearheaded by those 4 people.
What a party.
I think Nomura is probably a black mage.
I was going to say that too.
I'm going to say Kitase is like a dragoon.
I could get behind that.
So we're going to land on those. I think it's fighter, dragoon, black mage, bard.
Love it.
That's quite a party.
I feel like it's pretty well balanced. They don't have a great healer, but the bard can maybe serve as it.
He'll just buff them up. They don't need healing when they're buffed.
I feel healed when I hear Aerith's theme. Now, it may seem weird when you look at Nomura's earlier credits that he took such a major role in Final Fantasy VII, but I found this quote from Sakaguchi, which is taken from a 1994 Japanese book called Introduction to Game Design, and I think it sums up his philosophy and sort of explains why Nomura rose to more prominence.
I really enjoy smashing older ways of doing things. For example, if the story and setting have previously been done by one person, then this time I'll try letting 3 people create the story. Or I'll take a position we've had for a while and assign it to someone else, and create a new position. Creating games, after all, is still a developing field. If you change the way things are made or the roles to which people are assigned, then you should end up with a different final product too.
I am so in love with this structure for doing things. It feels so antithetical to the way that like business in Japan is generally done, with a more sort of strict adherence to structure and hierarchy.
Right.
But also, I think this is what makes games so endlessly exciting, is this era. It was just such a Wild West, and you wanted to be switching things up. You didn't want to fall into a routine. There was a great quote I heard recently, just sort of talking about games, and particularly writing games in particular, but comparing it with, the growth of movies and of cinema. And he described it, he goes, if you really think about it, games are in their just discovered Technicolor period, right now. So you go back 30 years ago and it's they haven't even introduced sound in that parallel, right?
Yeah.
I want more of this. I want more, hey, put people in different positions, try these weird things, give people chances that you wouldn't normally, because you're going to get something so rich and so powerful. It's something that somehow stands the test of time. It's crazy.
And it is wild to me how much marketing was thrown behind this product, which is clearly developed with more of an artistic bent than one that is like a marketing bent. And we'll get into, they did make a lot of very savvy marketing decisions, but it was more with like the hardware switch from Nintendo to Sony and less about the development of the game itself. I feel like in a lot of ways they made the game that they wanted to make, not just something based on bland market research. And you can see Square doing exactly the opposite of this with shit like Forspoken, which is coming out right now, which feels like you took a bunch of things that you think are going to be popular and put them in a blender, and then out comes like a gray smoothie that tastes like air. You know, it's so...
It's the LaCroix of video games.
You shut your fucking mouth, Cameron.
The unflavored LaCroix. And for all the shit I throw at like 8 or that people level at 13, I do feel like those were games developed based on what the people developing them wanted to make, and that definitely doesn't always feel like the kind of product Square churns out now. And we can criticize modern Square all day, the way that they have just thrown especially some of their Western studios under the bus, like the folks who made Guardians of the Galaxy, which sold really well but still not the like 10 trillion that Square wanted them to sell. I don't know, there's a lot going on
which
there.
Is a shame, because that was a great game.
I loved it. I thought it was great. And then Square also embraced NFTs for a while there and is not necessarily dismissive of AI creation, so...
They also made Kingdom Hearts 3, a sin for which I will never forgive them.
I look forward to discussing that game with you one day, because I don't know that I hate it as much as you do, but I'm interested to hear the reasons that you do.
I want to jump in on this discussion too.
No one hates anything as much as I hate Kingdom Hearts 3. But we'll save it for a bonus episode.
Oh, Nomura, that can be on the wrap up. Okay, we'll get back to it. So the quote that we read from Sakaguchi there would have been right around when FF6 was wrapping up. I'm not sure if 6 would have been out by now or it was just prior to that release. But they did start working on FF7 pretty much directly after 6 finished. So that quote comes around from when 7 is beginning early development. So it speaks to his loose approach to individualized roles. Sakaguchi defied some conventional Japanese rigidity in order to favor whatever creates the best final product. Hence, Nomura going from a field designer to being like third in command of everything going on with this game. We do not have the time to go over Squaresoft nor even the Final Fantasy series before 7, but I'm just going to give the briefest overview. Squaresoft as a games company began in 1983, spun off from its founder's father's electronics company, Denyu Sha. That founder's name was Masafumi Miyamoto. So Squaresoft came from a Nepo baby. Who would have thought? He was long gone by the time we got to Final Fantasy VII. I think he left sometime around 1991 as far as being involved in the actual development of games, but he was still a major stockholder. I think still is a major stockholder. Square quietly made some just okay games for a few years before finally establishing themselves with Final Fantasy I, just known as Final Fantasy, in 1987 for the Nintendo Famicom, which was known as the Nintendo Entertainment System in Western markets. Final Fantasy is a series, released 3 games on the OG NES and then 3 on the Super Nintendo. It gained a reputation as one of the premier Japanese RPG series, being only surpassed in sales by Dragon Quest in its home country, though I think Final Fantasy might have sold better than Dragon Quest in the Western market.
I think it did too.
These games were not only popular, but also innovative, twisting mechanics and storytelling in interesting new ways. The SNES games became notable for the active time battle system, which meant that the game was menu-based, but combat happened in a semi-real-time environment, with small bars filling up and turns being taken when the bar was full. Final Fantasy VI represented the series taking a darker turn, with villains committing genocidal acts and large ensemble casts of broken souls. 7 began life on the Super Nintendo, though not much major work was done on this version. From what I can tell, there exists a single screenshot of this version with the character Locke from Final Fantasy VI filling in a really actually pretty good-looking sprite-based town with a few NPCs. Resources, however, were diverted specifically to Chrono Trigger when the collaborative opportunity became available, and then shifted back to Final Fantasy VII in earnest only after that. Chrono Trigger was like the... I'm trying to think of the right band to name it after, but they brought together, it was, what's the Dragon Ball creator's name?
Akira Toriyama.
And I want to say one of the lead developers from Dragon Quest. So Chrono Trigger is this kind of fusion of Square and Enix coming together before they became Square Enix, to create kind of a power group of an RPG. So a lot of resources were shifted off of the Final Fantasy team onto Chrono Trigger. When that came out, they finally shifted back to FF7. So this had a massive effect on FF7's scattered development. And so what that also means for us is there was a huge pre-development phase, which lasted a lot longer than usual. So the team came up with a lot of ideas in those, I think it would have been 2 or 3 years worth of pre-development. As far as the pre-development of Final Fantasy VII goes, a few different story ideas were passed around, though the folks involved remember the early drafts a little differently than one another. It's commonly believed that ideas from initial drafts spun off into other games. Example, one early version penned by Sakaguchi took place in New York City, with an investigator tracking a group of terrorists destroying power reactors. This idea eventually became Parasite Eve, though it may have only been an idea for Parasite Eve in the first place, and not even something for Final Fantasy. Nomura remembers the protagonist as someone named Detective Joe, though Sakaguchi thinks that that's his original name for the protagonist of Lost Odyssey, which was a 360 game he worked on in like 2008. Memory is not a trustworthy thing, which is actually on theme for the game itself.
I love Lost Odyssey.
I love Detective Joe.
When I start up Final Fantasy VII, I actually rename Cloud to Detective Joe.
Did you really? That's amazing.
No, but that'd be really funny. Okay, I'll start it all over. There are also some whisperings, unconfirmed, that ideas spilled into Final Fantasy VIII, specifically Sorceress Edea, who would have been the head of a cult that worshipped the alien being Genova. It seems commonly accepted that Midgar, Cloud, Aerith, and the Life Stream were always going to be factors in the story, meaning that the battle between industrialization and the natural order of the environment was probably always a factor.
That has got to be one of the most timeless themes in literary history, right? It is the structure of the Lord of the Rings. It's what inspired Tolkien. It's filtered all throughout his work, and it's here in Final Fantasy, again, the best one, no matter what anyone else says.
Also in Avatar,
another timeless series that deserves accolades.
definitely made quite a footprint in pop culture history.
Yeah, Cameron, go watch Way of Water and then give that opinion.
I feel like we should specify we're talking about the Blue Alien, not Avatar, and not the actually excellent Avatar: The Last Airbender show.
Oh, let's depending on when you're listening to this, we're talking about the cartoon. We're reserving judgment of that Netflix one, yeah.
I will say that Sokka casting looks perfect from the 2 lines I've seen him say.
Sokka casting looks amazing. He does look fantastic. But then there's also the I'm gonna save the world with my friends energy to it that I am just not I don't know.
You can only really get away with that in an animated show.
Save that for Cloud and his friends.
Also, who else wants to fuck the Fire Lord? He's hot as shit. Is that Daniel Day Kim, right?
You mean Zaddy Lord Ozai?
He got strong from trying to resist the urge to punch people when they yell, "I am a surgeon" at him.
I am a surgeon.
Is he in that show?
Yeah.
That's the scene is him and the other guy.
Oh, I had no idea. I mean, I don't know. I don't watch it. I just know the memes.
I don't. I've just seen the memes. This is probably going to be super outdated here, so people are going to have no idea what we're talking about. Let's talk about Final Fantasy VII. It is commonly agreed that Nomura filled in the background information of the world and characters, while Kitase did the actual writing based on the broad shapes developed by Sakaguchi. Kitase did the event scenes for Final Fantasy VI, notably some of the most iconic plot-centric events like the famous Opera House sequence. Kitase's original ambition was in film direction, which becomes obvious in sequences like the opening, with its grand scope focus interwoven with quick cuts to things like spinning train wheels.
That's just like Kojima, right? Hideo Kojima also wanted to be a film director, and it was just an unrealized dream. So it's just these guys who didn't get to do the thing they wanted to do, so they just defined a generation of video games instead. No big deal.
Especially with like Kojima basically kind of creating his own role within Konami, because there wasn't like a position that he filled at that time. Like there wasn't like I'm just like I don't know, like a concept creator for a video game. I don't know what the actual term was, but like basically his position just did not exist before he decided to like make it.
Further cementing these cinematic ambitions was the original conceptualization of a completely seamless map. This would mean no separation between cutscenes, world maps, battle sequences, etc. And obviously this did not end up happening due to tech constraints, and probably wouldn't really be something that single-player Final Fantasies would do until like 12 or 15, I think was the closest I could come up with. 12 still has some individual loading screens. 15th is, I guess, open world. But regardless, they dreamt big for this project and then worked backwards to find out what was technologically feasible. Generally, there are 3 distinct story sections developed into fully realized ideas by different groups of writers on the project. Kitase and Kazushige Nojima, who was a scenario writer, worked on the Avalanche versus Shinra plot, Cloud's backstory, and Cloud's relationship with Sephiroth. Sakaguchi developed the concept of the life stream and pushed for a story with actual death, not just a sacrificial martyr kind that the series had previously seen. He also wanted to pursue the idea of someone not really being lost from your life when they do die. Finally, Nomura developed the concept of the moving antagonist, as well as some of those background details we talked about. Sephiroth doesn't sit at the top of a tower a la Final Fantasy VI Kefka or Final Fantasy IV's Golbez. He moves and is chased by the party as you move along. So between these 4 men, the messy but brilliant story came together eventually.
It's kind of crazy how, like you said, it's messy, but it's kind of crazy like how well it all came together, considering you got so many hands on this coming up with different ideas for the story. Like it could have easily become a like too many cooks situation where just none of it meshes well, but it does, and I don't understand that.
I think it's that embrace of the. It's not just embracing the messiness. It's like a genuine excitement at what's going to be created by working with everybody, by putting them in key roles and just kind of saying like, yeah, like just come up with an idea and we'll make it work. And if you're excited about that instead of hesitant about it, you kind of embrace the messiness ultimately, and you create something that is so far beyond the purview of a single creator.
Especially with what I was struck by this time was how many individual stories there are for the party members as well. I'd kind of forgotten about Barrett's backstory and the Dyne fight, and then I was really emotionally struck by the bit in Cosmo Canyon where Red 13 sees the fossilized, the stone version of his father, who then cries the actual tears that like fall from the statue when Red 13 kind of embraces his past and that his father was a hero. Like it was genuinely really affecting and really moving. I expected to maybe feel something at like Aerith's death or some of those bigger, Cloud Tifa moments, but there's a lot of other stories going on in the background that end up serving the overall themes. Like with Red 13, a big theme is identity based on his genetic history. And then he also has a false name. You don't learn that his name is, I believe, Nanaki until you get to that section of the game. So there's another person sort of lying about their past. Or like Barrett only refers to Marlene as his daughter, even though she isn't necessarily biologically his daughter, which again is something that is not spelled out for you right away. There's not those sort of exposition dumps, and so these themes of identity are then present in all of those other characters as well.
You mean you can't tell she's not his daughter but just by looking at them? Hats off to you for not seeing race.
Tyler, you mentioned these emotional beats that happen throughout the story, and you are surprised because it's not just like the big Aerith death that gets you. It's something in every single story, and knowing that these stories were worked on by different individuals, you can imagine the creator is pulling from their own life, their own experience, something really specific in order to tell that story. And then you take that and you let someone else find another moment in their life that it would be like the three of us just trying to be like, hey, what's a time where you really confronted mortality and or new life? And then we each came up with our own creation that was based on our own experience. We would have something honest that would connect with the player, with the gamer, and relate to something in their own life. And then all of a sudden you have a tapestry that is woven together by different perspectives on a consistent theme that becomes all the more real because it has just that connection to like an honest moment in the creator's life. And so you could imagine for Red 13 seeing his father, the fossilized version of him, you can imagine like one of these creators maybe seeing like their father having to identify him after he died. That kind of, it just connects us through this like universal human experience, which I totally love.
Again, on theme with the connection of the live stream. I feel like it's a game that is deceptively deep for what a lot of people remember from it, which are maybe moments or music or the Midgar section in particular. What was so crazy about doing research on this game and for this episode was it felt like every time I would peel back one layer, there would be something else to get deeper into, or we'll get into things like the character name influences. Just reading about why Tifa is named Tifa, it could be an episode unto itself. There's so much going on in the background that, especially playing this as an adult, the last time I played it all the way through, I was a teenager. I appreciate it in such a different way. And it is a shame that the translation is so iffy because I can feel some of that original intention being stifled. I haven't played any of the re-releases that have the newer translations or the updated corrected ones, so I'd be interested to go to that at some point. But I'm gaining a lot from it, more than I expected. There's a lot of early internet chatter that came from early screenshots of Square's first experiment with 3D, which showed 3 characters from Final Fantasy VI in a 3D space. Called Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game, many publications incorrectly assumed this was a demo for an upcoming Nintendo 64 Final Fantasy release. However, not only was this untrue, but the N64 was never assumed to be the console that Square would work on, at least not by the higher-ups at Square. Their early 3D tests were done with Silicon Graphics, which was the same 3D hardware that the N64 used. So while Nintendo was a reasonable assumption, also given the fact that they had essentially been a Nintendo second-party developer for years prior to this, it was never really in development for the system. They did for a while intend to maybe use the failed 64DD, which was the attachable disk drive for the Nintendo 64. They always intended to use lengthy cutscenes and create a very large game. However, development never really started in earnest for Nintendo's system. And while they were working towards some kind of N64 demo, Sakaguchi just kind of decided against pursuing that company and that system. Here's a quote from character programmer Hiroshi Kawai.
All this work was toward, I think they called it the Shoshinkai, Nintendo's Space World trade show in Japan. And here I am coding, kind of being able to do lead dev work for the Space World demo. Then I think it was near the end of the year. Sakaguchi-san just gathers everybody in the middle of this gigantic floor where we had a bunch of devs working in the middle of Meguro, and he just casually announces, we're not developing for Nintendo anymore. So all of my work at that point kinda just went down the drain.
So couple quick asides here that I was in, and it's a little hard to find. As I've mentioned, the development of the game was messy since it was in pre-production for so long. There was a Sony disc add-on that was in development for I think the Super Nintendo, and Nintendo ended up working instead of with Sony with Philips to make the CDI, which resulted in some of the worst Nintendo games of all time, the Wand of Gamelon and Hotel Mario and such. So classically seen as one of the biggest gaming blunders of all time. So I think it's possible that Square had some early communication with Sony when this disc-based add-on was maybe something that was in development. So it's possible that FF7 had some Super Nintendo disc-based add-on Devo, some development for the 64 disc drive before eventually they did settle on going with Sony, which we'll get into that a bit here. Since we know how things end, this doesn't seem like a weird choice, them going with the PlayStation, but that's only in retrospect. And the common narrative in the time since has been that Square moved development to the PS1 because of the greater disc space and the lower production price of disc compared to the limited space and greater price of the Nintendo 64 cartridges. However, what we sort of overlook in retrospect is that this was a super risky move since Nintendo was the established company. Remember, this transition would have happened in a PlayStation before Final Fantasy VII. They may have had something like Crash at the time, and they were, definitely blossoming, but they were not the juggernaut yet. And this shift in development was before they became the established victor in the console wars. Some developers also believe that the disc versus cart narrative has been sort of pushed forward by Square out of respect to Nintendo, saying that they believe that Sony simply offered the better monetary deal, while also acknowledging that disc-based media was the future. So Sony really wanted Square. They really wanted a killer app. We'll get into a bit with the marketing, but I do think that Square could have made a game for the 64 and in many ways may have intended to, but ended up going with Sony for more than just reasons of disk space and lower production costs. I think there was a lot of behind the scenes wheeling and dealings, and Sony eventually really pushed to get Square specifically.
I mean, if I was Square, I would be going to each of them being all like, that's a really sweet offer, but those other guys, they just doubled it. You think you could triple it? No? Okay, then.
And so even more significant to this shift was Nintendo's response, which was a pretty hearty fuck you to Square. Now, this could be for a couple of reasons, and maybe a multitude of these. It could be because Square took a big money-making series to a rival company, or it could be that Square's departure as essentially a Nintendo second-party developer caused others to jump ship as well, Enix being the other big RPG developer to shift to PlayStation. But some people think that the split was slightly overblown by the media at the time. Here's a quote from Yoshihiro Maruyama, who was the executive vice president of Square US during this time.
I don't think anyone from Nintendo gave us a hard time. They said, "Oh, we don't need that." That's what they said. Their philosophy has always been that Nintendo hardware is for their games, and if a publisher wants to publish, okay, you can do it, but if you don't like it, we don't want you.
However, when development got moving on the PlayStation in earnest, it got moving fast. Real boots-on-the-ground development of Final Fantasy VII only took a little over a year, which was actually the shortest amount of time that a Final Fantasy game had ever been developed in. Up to the NES ones, this is the shortest Devo time. So not only were they developing their largest game in the shortest amount of time, they were doing so on new hardware for a new system from a different parent company and learning how to work with that system at the same time. The team size grew from somewhere between 30 and 60 who worked on the SNES games to somewhere between 150 and 350 for Final Fantasy VII, with many of them being outsourcing partners and overseas offices. So everyone in the credits is not necessarily everyone who worked on the game. There was some outsourcing, especially with some of the graphical stuff, and some of those movies were not necessarily developed in-house by Square staff. They were outsourced to other sort of more like animation-based companies, from what I understand.
You never know with credits. I worked on a... actually, I didn't work on a film. I had some footage that I shot that got used for a documentary. And I was so pleased with this. My footage opens and closes that movie.
Let's
and
go.
I am not credited in it.
Let's not go.
Wow.
When it played at South by Southwest, I was like, I got to go to the premiere, but I was looking for my name, and I was all like, this literally is bookended by stuff I shot, and I am nowhere in the credits. This is bullshit. Anyway.
So once they got into actual active development, Nomura had envisioned both Barrett and Kate Sith, and that is actually how it's pronounced. There's a lot of chatter online that it's like Katshi, I think, is the correct Irish pronunciation. But now that trailers for Rebirth are out, they just say Kate Sith. So that's how we're going to pronounce it. I just wanted to put that aside there because I know someone might get mad about it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad because I thought I was going crazy just pronouncing it Kate Sith.
So Cloud was always intended to be the lead character, and Yuffie and Vincent were almost cut due to time constraints, which is why they're technically optional and don't necessarily play a huge role in the vital aspects of the story. And yes, spoiler alert, Aerith dies.
What?
But cruelly, one of the original ideas Kitase had was to kill off almost everyone before the end of the game, leaving your final party at just 3, though which 3 are unspecified. If I had to guess, I'd say probably like Cloud, Barrett, Tifa seem like the central ones, but I'm not sure. That's just me kind of guessing. But this fits the gameplay of characters not being railroaded into specific roles. You could really have any 3 characters and finish the game normally and just fine.
Who are your final 3 characters?
Oh, final 3?
Who are mine?
Yeah, the last time you beat this game, who are your final 3 characters?
I think it was Cloud. I think it was Cloud, Barrett, and Tifa,
That's
actually.
awesome.
Those are my favorite 3. And statistically speaking, when I looked through, they're pretty solid up there. Like, that's a pretty decent party.
The last time I beat it was probably, Cloud, Vincent, and Yuffie.
Oh, nice.
What I think I probably would have done.
Going for those the optional ones.
Yeah, I mean, they were cool. And the first time I played Final Fantasy VII, I didn't realize they were optional. This was just
Funny.
Came across them.
I just came across them, and Yuffie is like a hard character to get to join. Like, you kind of have to know
You do all
what
that
to
Wu-Tai
do.
shit.
Yeah, I just did it on accident, and it never really hit me that, oh wow, like I was supposed to look that up. Like I totally fucked it up. That was one of the things. Well, we'll talk about this more in the gameplay section, but just how much in this game is optional really blew me away.
It's a lot. Yeah, the Yuffie one's hard because that's also hampered by the translation because you have to pick specific choices in dialogue, but the way it's translated to English, the 2 dialogue options sometimes sound completely identical. So it's like 4 coin tosses for when you bump into her in the forest. You fight her. If you beat her, you can't visit a menu because she'll steal your money and run. And there's a save point that tricks you. You can't go save because she'll steal your money and run. And then you have to pick the right 4 dialogue options before she actually joins. But you'll keep bumping into her in forests only, and then have to eventually pick the right 4 or she won't join. But it is possible to keep picking the wrong choices over and over and over again. So I think she's more easily missed than Vincent. Like, when you get to the mansion, it's pretty obvious that there's something you need to do. Like, there's a puzzle to solve and there's a thing
the story
to do.
kind of pushes you to Vincent.
Yeah, and he's more vital. I think you can skip Yuffie's plot, and it affects the Turks, but it doesn't really change that much else as far as the main plot goes. Whereas Vincent being matched up with, I think it's Lucretia? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah, Lucretia.
Mm-hmm, who's Sephiroth's actual biological mom. So he's more involved in the story as a whole.
My characters were Sid, Vincent, and Cloud.
I do love Sid. I fucking love Sid in this game. But eventually, the idea of losing just one central character, not in a way that made them a martyr, won out. It solidified a feeling of real loss, but also aided in the environmentalist and spiritual themes of the story. Aerith may not be dead, but she is still a part of the air, the earth, the life stream, and our hearts. Side note, Aerith's name is Aerith because it's just air and earth combined. I had never realized that before.
I never realized that until just now. I was looking at it and I was all like, I wonder if like air and earth.
I thought about like, should I just leave that there as a hint for later on, but I'm just going to call it out.
It's a surprise tool that we'll use for later.
That's why the translation of air is so odd to me, because in the original American translation, Aerith, with a TH at the end, is changed to an S. So I don't know if they were trying to translate it phonetically rather than translate the sort of intention of the character name. You know, Air, Earth makes more sense in English with the TH at the end, but Aeriths, I think, sounds closer to the Japanese pronunciation of it. I don't know.
I mean, we live on the planet Is, don't you know?
I also believe that it was maybe a mispronunciation where they tried to say, you know, like, Aerith dies, and they were all like, oh, Air is dead. Air is dead. The environment is so structural to the story. Air is dead. Eris.
Boys, I think we got there. I think that was it exactly. Now, even more wild to me was that the battle system only came into fully active development after work was done on the fields and the stories, the fields being the environments you're in when you're outside of battle. So this means that battle director Akira Fuiji had only a practical 6 months to develop this side of the game. The aim of the materia system was to give the player full customization of how the characters were used. While folks were likely to trend towards, say, using Cloud as a warrior and Aerith as a healer, there are technically builds you can do where these roles are reversed, with creative materia use and clever leveling. To counter this and give characters distinct personality within the battle system, Nomura came up with the idea of limit breaks, which are character exclusive, and these are an expansion of desperation attacks from Final Fantasy VI. The bar is kind of more or less the same between the two games. There are distinctions between the stats of the characters. You can see that Barrett has, I think, the highest HP, but the lowest dex, which means he's the slowest. Someone like Red 13, I think, lands right in the middle for all the stats. I was surprised Vincent is the best magic user in the game. I had figured he was more of an attacker based on his build, but when I looked at the stat layout, he's better for magic.
Just give him all that green materia, man.
Yeah, baby. And it was around this time, when the game shifted into full development and thus fully 3D, that Nomura took an even more active role. His designs, which are full of spikes, little details, distinctly oversized boots and swords, translated particularly well into 3D. Here's a quote from Matonori Sakikabara, which was he was a movie director for the title.
Nomura-san was a great 2D artist, but his characters worked especially well in 3D. He spent a ton of time making the game characters look like his original designs, which was one of the big secrets behind the creation of the Final Fantasy VII characters.
Nomura's slightly blocky yet intricate designs matched what designers were able to feed through the PlayStation to your TV. Personally, I think the game also managed a kind of international fusion in its design. Cloud and Sephiroth are clearly kind of dueling samurai, in fact inspired by the real rivalry of Musashi Miyamoto and Sasaki Kojiro, but all of this is filtered through the lens of American urban dystopia. This without mentioning the strong Native American influence seen in Cosmo Canyon, further hammering home the direct criticism of American destruction of natural land.
That is so... I want to just pause here because it reminds me of some of the myth making behind, say, Star Wars. And George Lucas pulling from many different mediums, genres, stories already to create something wholly new, something relatively out of like whole cloth, even though really the only unique thing about it is no one had thought to combine these things together in this particular way. And so getting what we get here feels similar to that. Arguably, Is Final Fantasy VII the Star Wars of video games?
Definitely Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, and Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy IX.
They clearly love Star Wars. I'm surprised there aren't more like beam swords in the series as a whole. Right. Maybe that would be too overt. Well, and then, 12 especially is...
Oh, that's the main offender, absolutely.
What's his name? Balthier, I think, is just Han Solo, who, to be fair... one of the best characters in the series as a whole. Great voice acting on the American side, too.
Oh, gosh, his name. Bosch. is also a great character.
I'm Captain Bosch of Dalmasca.
Don't listen to Ondor's lies.
This is what we need. We need mainstream popular culture media to be a little bit more like Final Fantasy, where what it does is it's all like, we did that once before. Let's just do it differently, but let's do it very differently, at least stylistically.
Let's just fuse it with all these other ideas.
And then in 7, you can also see, well, in all of Square's work around this time, especially fucking Xenogears, you can tell they watched Evangelion. And a lot of those sort of thematic themes, yes, very well spoken. A lot of the themes of identity or self-doubt, thinking that you are a personal failure, so turning into somebody else entirely, as well as using Judeo-Christian imagery as backdrop, which may not be super thematically relevant, but certainly sounds cool. A lot of that is in the air at this time in anime, with Eva especially.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely accurate with Evangelion and with, you're right, with Xenogears.
Damn it, Faye, get in the robot.
I was talking with my wife about this yesterday. What is it about Japan that has so much of this, like, hey, you're this person, but you're also this person. You're both of these people at the same time. Like, I don't know what it is in the cultural psyche in Japan that makes that motif so, because it's so recurrent, and I don't know, I have no idea where like that's grounded.
It might be like a familial expectation, like, you know, when like they have so many stories of like Japanese children who like want to go off and, I don't know, like just like be an artist, for example, but then you got the strict father that's like, no, you got to study, get all good grades, and like take over the business after your father like retires or something like that.
Got it. It's like that. There are two wolves inside of you. One of you wants to work in hospice care, but the other one is being groomed to take over your father's successful anime company.
How can I have two wolves in me when I got that dog in me? Come on.
I do think there's something to be said about, Japanese expectation of self versus, like, we as Americans are kind of told our whole lives, like, be true to yourself, or, you know, the kind of American exceptional individualism. We're
Yes.
more about our own unique identities and embracing that own unique identity, which I think has good and bad. I'm not here to broadly dismiss all ideas of American individualism. I think there's ways it can be taken to bad extremes. Don't tread on me. But I think there's ways where telling kids that they are special and can do anything they want, it is useful, psychologically speaking. Whereas in Japan, it is much more about a sort of collective mindset where you are not necessarily the most important person in your own life. So what I think that does create for a lot of Japanese individuals, I say as a white man who has never been to Japan or spoken to anyone from Japan, I think it can create that idea of a dual identity where you're this kind of person at work, but you're this kind of person at home. There's also a lot of things like infidelity in Japan where you stay together in a family unit for maybe a child, or because the marriage was, you know, set up maybe not necessarily by yourself, and then you've got a mistress, or you've got this sort of other group of people that you hang out with that is separate from the home. I wouldn't be surprised if that, you know, then filters into a lot of Japanese media and fiction.
I realize a bit more clearly now that there's likely some member of a 3-person podcast in Japanese right now being like, what is America's obsession with chosen one storylines? Why is that so so crucial to the character of the American psyche?
And yeah, you know, we can level our own criticism at ourselves, where I often put myself down because I am not the greatest human that ever lived. You know what I mean? It's hard to find importance in your office job when everyone from birth told you, like, you could be president, and you're sitting there at your desk doing an Excel spreadsheet thinking, why aren't I president?
I'm still just waiting for my call to action. It's gonna happen, guys, I promise.
Where's my letter to Hogwarts?
Not that. I'll find something else.
Fuck all that. Let's talk about the music. Now, we haven't touched on it much in the podcast as a whole, but the jump to disc-based media may have had the greatest impact on audio. See, previously, composers only had so many audio channels to work with. This is especially noticeable with early games of the 8-bit era. A song might use 3 audio channels, but there are only 3 audio channels total. So that means something like the bass line is also shared with sound effects, which then take priority. So swinging a sword might actually cause a line of audio to drop out. If you boot up an NES title, and especially not something emulated, like play it on the old hardware, you'll notice it pretty quickly. And I think you hear it in some of the older Final Fantasies where it's got like doon 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 doon, but that might drop out when you hear like ching ching of a sword whacking. So there's only so many sounds that can actually come out of the machine through your TV at any given time. Additionally, audio channels weren't just plug in the notes. You can't just use the Mario Paint audio editor. While composers may have written out sheet music, you couldn't just feed that into a game. It had to be coded in, meaning that musicians were also programmers. With the advent of disc-based media, real audio could be loaded in, albeit slightly compressed for size. While this means that technically games could use full recorded instrumentation for audio, the reality is that due to compression, they often would not necessarily use real instrumentation. It would utilize too much of the memory space. I'm being a little reductive in my explanation here. Some of that is because I don't necessarily understand all of the technical aspects of it, but the point is that soundtracks could be bigger and not just using the built-in hardware sound channels. However, all this comes with a trade-off. Higher quality audio played directly from the disc also adds additional loading time. While Uematsu first thought to add vocals to all of the music, not just One Winged Angel at the end, he opted not to do so so that the sound would load immediately when the game was booted up or when you kicked into a battle screen or into a new section. As such, FF7 still uses the PlayStation's internal sound chip. Now, while this means that he was still limited in the number of sound channels available, there was a greater amount of them anyway compared to the 16-bit music he'd been composing previously, with 8 channels specifically reserved for sound effects and 16 for the music.
Jeez.
Now, the trade-off is that the music for Final Fantasy VII sounds a little retro in instrumentation compared to its contemporaries. Those MIDI horns are clearly carryovers from the SNES games. This is actually something that Uematsu has since expressed disappointment over, having compared his own work to specifically Suikoden's sound quality and feeling like he came out as the lesser quality work in terms of fidelity.
That's such an audiophile concern to have when you have created such a fucking banger of a soundtrack. I understand that it's like, oh, but the fidelity is just not quite there. He did so much better with that other thing, but my God, like if I just don't feel it in my veins whenever like a new soundtrack pops up in this game.
I can't even recall any track from Suikoden, and I've played that game. I can't think of a theme. I can't think of any sort of melody. Just nothing stands out.
The only thing I remember from Suikoden's music is that the battle theme has a really annoying off-time chime that I remember thinking that I had like tinnitus, because it in the background you just hear like every now and then, and it's not really like synced, and maybe I'm misremembering something here, but it would drive me fucking bananas every time. I like Suikoden 1, but something I would often turn the soundtrack off for that game.
You hear that, Uematsu? Your game stands the test of time. Fidelity be damned.
Truly are the GOAT.
The soundtrack also came together pretty quickly and was composed in just 8 months, a shockingly small amount of time considering the number of compositions. His goal was also to make something to rival movies in terms of cinematic quality, which to him meant to never reuse tracks. I assume he's not talking about like the battle theme, but like that every town or new scenario would have a new track.
But different again, battle theme every fucking fight.
God, can you imagine? Oh, God. Again, this proved impossible given the scope of the game. And we can touch on it more later when we get to the game itself. But Uematsu also makes dramatic use of leitmotif, which are recurrent musical themes that associate with a particular person, idea, or situation. Most characters have a theme that may be repeated at certain points of the game. See Aerith's theme and the accompanying track, Flowers Blooming in the Church. But there are 3 primary leitmotifs: the Shinra theme, which is an ascending scale, Sephiroth's theme of 3 tones, and the main theme. I'm trying to like replicate them in real time, and it's a little hard to think of it. I know that Sephiroth's is which you just hear in the background of a bunch of tracks, and it fills you with dread because you know, like, oh, that's Sephiroth, and he's coming to stab you with his big-ass sword. I think the best musical moment in the game, I know I'm getting aside myself here, but I just love this particular spot, is the Nibelheim flashback, and you see the sort of Sephiroth like digging through the files relating to his own origins and learning about the ancients, and then Cloud visits him, and Sephiroth is just fully taken by madness, and he's talking to Cloud. He pushes past him to go see Genova, and Cloud is like, "Where are you going?" And Sephiroth says, "To see my mother." And then the second he says that, it clicks into dun, 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 and it's the same like background kind of eerie music, and then just that theme kicks in, and it's just fucking shivers, man. It's so good.
And I think the Shinra theme, isn't it the da-na, da-na-na?
And then the main theme is do 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 do, which you hear all the time. And it's not always the exact same notes. It's like the same sequence of notes, but in a slightly different key, minor or major. And every character has one of those, or a lot of different themes are repeated, or there's a couple of notes, but those 3 are the ones that you'll see in the most amount of tracks, because they're themes that, play through most of the game itself. My summation is Final Fantasy VII is one of the best composed soundtracks of all time that is occasionally, admittedly, hampered by its own instrumentation. The one thing I had trouble finding much information on was the field design. I should point out how pre-rendered backgrounds work, which everything except the world map is done with the world map and the battle screens. So anytime where it's just characters walking in towns or in dungeons are pre-rendered backgrounds. So these field designs are built in 3D, they're ray traced, and then saved as static images on the disc. And note that this doesn't mean that the 3D characters are walking on a 2D field. There's still basic 3D geometry behind the pre-rendered backgrounds. So even though it's called a background, it's actually kind of the surface layer. But the rest of the geometry isn't visible because it's hidden. This is why, Cloud can move in and out of the scenery and gets actually larger or smaller. He's not just walking on a 2D image. He's in a 3D space. It's just, like boxes on a black void with a image overlaid on top of them. What this accomplishes is maximizing the impact of each scene. Again, it's very cinematic. There's a lot of Dutch angles. You can tell they all went and watched some movies to prepare for this. And it fits a lot more stuff on the discs and looks nice, especially on a slightly blurry CRT where you cannot as easily tell that it's pre-rendered. To fit as much of FF7 as exists on just a few discs without this pre-rendered aspect wouldn't really be possible. As a point of comparison, while something like Ocarina of Time was mostly in full 3D, it also uses many screens that are pre-rendered. And again, you can really notice these now when you play on modern systems, the difference between a pre-rendered scene that isn't just a camera fixed on a 3D space, but is an actual image laid over basic geometry.
God, I feel like I'm getting a real education here in game design. Okay, all right.
Well, and what's also nice is, since this game is one of the bigger, releases of all time, there is more stuff written about it.
A wealth of content, yeah.
Now, while Final Fantasy VII was not designed specifically with a Western audience in mind, it was localized and marketed aggressively towards Western markets. Well, it was published by Square themselves in Japan on January 31st, 1997. It was published directly by Sony in North America and PAL territories as the first game of a 6-game deal with Squaresoft. Now, to demonstrate the difference between the popularity of the console-style RPG in Japan versus the rest of the world, Square's profits at the time of Final Fantasy VII's release were 95% collected from Japanese marketplaces. We're talking 3 or 4% of their total profits came from the USA and 1% from Europe. However, at Sony's insistence, they placed more importance on the Western market for Final Fantasy VII and relocated their U.S. headquarters out of Seattle. They were previously in Seattle to be close to Nintendo's Seattle offices, and down to sunny Los Angeles, California.
Yeah.
I remember going down to, not for Sony, but being down in LA. It wasn't my first time, but I think it might have been my first time as an adult. I went down there for the movie premiere of this like awful indie film I worked on freshman year of college. And I landing at the airport and like taking a cab to go to the theater, and you pass the Square Enix building, and it just this, big skyscraper with Square Enix right at the top, and thinking like, oh my God, that's so
There it
cool.
is.
I wonder what it's like to work there. Not realizing it's probably fucking miserable.
Jump cut to a bunch of really sad office workers sitting at Excel sheets, like projecting profits. There's the one localizer who also probably has a gun to his head, like
Thinking to himself, my mom said I could be president. Why aren't I president yet?
And actually, speaking of localization, one odd quirk that ties in more with the earlier Final Fantasy series. The older Final Fantasy titles for Nintendo were translated by a guy named Ted Woolsey, who had a very specific voice. He didn't always translate things exactly as they were written in Japanese, but you can kind of tell a Ted Woolsey translation just from a couple of quirks of how he, well, I was going to say speaks, but his voice within the text. He, however, turned down an offer to move to LA to work on 7. Sakaguchi insisted instead, somewhat bafflingly, that the English translation then be conducted in-house by the Japanese development team. Eventually, there was a localizer from Square USA named Michael Baskett, but he was given reference documents that were also in Japanese, and then probably just asked to fill in Excel boxes that were unsorted and devoid of context, and just translate things line by line. Now, what resulted was a more faithful translation to the letter of the Japanese language. English versions of Japanese titles up to this point would often stray drastically from the source material in a way that really has not aged well in a lot of ways. But he also created a script that was filled with typos and grammatical weirdness, such as, "This guy are sick," which is the famous first line that people notice, like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Aerith says it in, I think it's Sector 8, but it's within the first, 2 hours of the game. Now, because Japanese as a language is so context-sensitive, someone being unable to look at where exactly translated dialogue fits because of time and resource restraints really hinders the final product. So again, we don't know the exacts, and there's a great interview with Richard Honeywood, who was one of the Square localizers who worked with the company from 97 to 07 on GameSpite. If you just look up GameSpite interview with Richard Honeywood, you can find some really technical details of the constraints that they were put under. But Michael Baskett was not given a lot of time to translate the game, and I think he was just given essentially strings of Japanese text. You can tell sometimes that he's not 100% sure who the subject of the line is, and so you end up with something that can occasionally sound pretty stilted. Again, usually you can get the gist of stuff, but some of the subtleties or the flow are lost within that original translation. One other quick aside, in Western markets, Final Fantasy IV was released as Final Fantasy II, and 6 was released as 3. I do not know why this naming convention was then dropped for 7. I've seen some people theorize that re-releases of the earlier Final Fantasy games were already being planned for a release outside Japan. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and Chrono Trigger were all eventually ported to the PlayStation. So it's possible that it was released just as 7 to fix that error and then prep for people who are only going to play the games on PlayStation. Or they might have just been like, this is stupid, we should just get up to where the series is and just create a more unified naming convention. I think most people who have played a Final Fantasy at this point kind of know that the American 2 isn't the real 2, and ditto with 3 and 6. But it, as a kid, I remember not knowing that. So I was like, where are 4, 5, 6? I was baffled for a while and thought they were for some system that I didn't own. Another thing worth mentioning about the international release is that it was also released in Japan as Final Fantasy VII international. This wasn't necessarily uncommon back in the day, since English releases were not developed simultaneously with the Japanese releases. It meant the developers got to put the game back in the oven for a few more months and work out some kinks. But there are a lot of changes. So think of like, the patches down the line to fix balancing issues that we get with modern games. Occasionally, Japanese releases would view this, gap in time while things were being localized as a way to put in some more patches, which again was probably really hard on the English development team, who already were understaffed and stressed, and then were being given new lines of dialogue to translate, again devoid of context. Things are a lot easier now as far as international development, but they were very messy at the time. Some of these changes, though, include touched up backgrounds, added text. In the original version, Barrett doesn't tell you how to run, so you could technically miss this. Hold X to run. He doesn't have that weird throwaway line, which playing through this time, I could tell, like, that was kind of a weird spot to put that. Barrett just tells you to run at some arbitrary point.
Are you really trying to tell me that you can't imagine just like walking and having Barrett suddenly being all like, run, bitch, run?
No, you're right. Actually, in the canon makes sense. There were changes to mini games. Puzzles were made a little more sensible to solve. I couldn't find exactly what this was referring to, but I know they were rebalanced a little. There were changes to encounter rates. Some changes are pretty major, though, like the addition of the Ruby and Emerald super bosses, which were not in the original release. There are added flashback story sequences in Disc 2, which makes some aspects of the story make more sense. Tifa finds Cloud in the train graveyard in a flashback, so she finds him after he ditches the mansion and walks his way back to Midgar. And then the actual fate of Zack is not shown in the original release. You previously only find it detailed in a document in the mansion basement that just says that he was shot when he was leaving. It's pretty vague. And the story fight with the Diamond Weapon was added in. Previously, you didn't fight Diamond Weapon as part of the story. So there was a full boss added into the international release, which was then ported back.
So just for clarification, the version that we got here in the States, is that this version, this international version?
That's correct, yeah. So all the changes I'm talking about, we would never really have known about. So there was that original Japanese release, which was missing the stuff I just talked about. When the US got the release, we got all of those things. So we don't know a version in the West unless we imported the original.
Okay.
We don't know a version where a Diamond Weapon fight doesn't exist. And then our version, the international version, was then re-released in Japan as Final Fantasy VII International.
That's good. And also for us Crisis Core players, we all know that Zack wasn't simply shot. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, all 7 of you.
I need to play it. I especially after going through all this research, I haven't ever played Crisis Core, and I'd like to now.
I think I own it. I own several of the Final Fantasy VII series.
The compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Call it its correct name, please.
Thank you. I was searching for it. I own several of them. I don't think I've beaten a single one of them, though.
Well, I mean, it's Crisis Core is re-released, so now would be the time to do it.
Yeah.
Oh, I really should do that. Yeah. I take that back. The only one that I've actually finished, I think, was Advent Children.
Now, when this was then all compiled back into a Japanese release in October of 1997, for Japan only, they added a 4th disc. Did you guys know about this prior to this?
I did not.
I had never heard about it, and I saw like one wiki article just kind of toss out like, oh, and that's on the 4th disc. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about, 4th disc?
The mythical 4th disc of Final Fantasy VII.
This disc and the contents of it have never been translated, but before you get too up in arms, it's sort of like an interactive Final Fantasy VII encyclopedia. Through menus, you can explore the world map and the locations, which also includes artwork for all items in-game. Not everything is shown on the map, mostly towns and not dungeons or any area that has any sort of encounters in it. There's a section called Data File, which is like a model and info viewer, and then there's Making, which is early screenshots and a small making of documentary. I tried to watch some of this. I did find the disc online and went through some of the material. But since I don't speak Japanese, the making of documentary didn't really help out much in the making of this podcast. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, everyone.
How dare you?
This is only adding to a thesis I've been sitting on the entire time. I originally called this the like Star Wars. Final Fantasy VII is the Star Wars of PlayStation 1 games, but I really think it might be the Lord of the Rings, including the fact that there was a special director's cut, an extended edition where you could get a making of documentary. I think there's a possibility, thinking about, where your life can fork into different directions, a theme that we've discussed many times just in our podcast. What if this had the documentary, the fourth disc was available in America, and I saw it as a kid? I might be making video games right now. Life could have been so different.
What a tangled web we weave, the life stream ebbs and flows in many directions, time ever unceasing moves forward. All of this referring to the fourth disc is very cool. But at this point with the internet, you're really not missing too much by not having hands on this disc. So while it feels a little weird not to have this sort of big, untranslated thing, it's not like the white whale of the story. You can find most of it online at this point. The marketing budget in the US was $20 million.
What the
This
fuck?
for a game is still kind of absurd, but especially for the time, completely absurd. Sony did not just want to sell this title, they wanted to sell PlayStations. Final Fantasy VII was used as a bridge to steal away some of Nintendo's base when Sony saw weakness. They quadrupled down on a 3-stage, year-long advertising blitz that focused on 3 core tenets. 1. Final Fantasy VII was graphically representative of the next generation of gaming. 2. Squaresoft has an amazing track record and are prestigious artists. 3, and 3 in all caps, Final Fantasy VII is only on PlayStation. Basically, quote, "This is going to be a work of art that you can only experience on the PlayStation," end quote. That was my quote. I'm quoting me. The fact that it was an RPG was kind of de-emphasized, to put it mildly. Here's an actual excerpt of Sony's marketing plan, listed under the challenges section.
Getting the secondary market to buy the product. The complex, mainly turn-based combat systems of RPGs and of Final Fantasy VII may be too large of a gaming hurdle for the secondary target to get over. While the title's exploration style, action elements, faster turn-based combat, mature themes, and overall cinematic look will be attractive to this market, the game's RPG style may be too much. RPG gameplay seems to be attractive to a specific type of gamer, although Squaresoft has been able to attract the broadest section of this type of gamer.
And then this next part is also from the marketing plan.
Create maximum awareness and a groundswell of support from all game players. The goal is to allow game players to fully experience the visual and dramatic excitement of the game and to help them rise above any prejudices that they may have about RPGs.
I love that word being used in relation to RPGs, prejudices.
I mean, it kind of does. I mean, it kind of still does exist now. Like, the recently the Game Awards happened with Baldur's Gate winning Game of the Year, and everybody was giving it shit, being like, "How did this win? It's just turn-based battles and dice rolling. How did this beat Spider-Man 2?" And it's like, it's that stigma still there.
Is that really what people said?
Yeah, they're like, all you do is roll dice in that game. How the fuck did this win Game of the Year?
I am in a rage. I have the fury of 1,000 suns at that mere comment. When a game
behind my eyes.
yes, flames on the side of my face, weeping, heaving breaths.
I've never been this mad before. Where is my boy?
That just, I don't, that blows my mind. But I do want to defend the idea of RPG prejudice because I went to high school starting in 2005. And I remember what it was like to be a role-playing game fan in the era of first-person shooters. All right? There were a lot of words that I will not use in polite company that were levied at me because I loved RPGs, not because I wore pink or because I walked around in a slim frame. No, it was because I loved RPGs that these bullies wanted to ruin my life. I'm just kidding. I really wasn't bullied in high school. In fact, I kind of bullied other people, but we'll get into that with my therapist, which none of you will be privy to.
Actually, the first time in college I really felt like I clicked with a group of people was talking about JRPGs. I had one friend who was sort of into RPGs with me in high school, not as into it as I was, but we weirdly bonded over Skies of Arcadia.
Right on.
The GameCube re-release. fucking baller game. Very expensive. I should not have spent money on it to repurchase it as an adult. It wasn't worth it. I haven't played it since, but I own that disc. Don't tell my wife. What was I talking about? The first like good conversation I had in college, or the first time I really clicked and made more friends, was being like, y'all played Golden Sun?
Oh, right on.
And everyone at the table had fucking played Golden Sun. So, there are dozens of us. Dozens.
It is amazing. Maybe we've talked about this before, but the sort of epidemic on college campuses with young people leaving high school, but because of their relationship to their phone, they're still connected to the friends that you're really supposed to leave behind at a certain point and meet new people, and so they're not going out, they're not doing these campus events. And you look back to when we all met one another at that time, and the fact that we were bonding with each other over video games, which had nothing to do with the degrees that any of us were pursuing. It was just a thing that we all loved, that we were able to build like a real connection over video games. To quote that character from Ted Lasso, our life.
So I actually have a theory. This is slightly removed from anything we're talking about, but I have theorized sometimes that games are actually the closest media to theater than anything else that exists. And I'll tell you why. Because when you watch a play, it's different every night, and it's very dependent on where you are in that theater. No single person is experiencing exactly the same thing that you are, even if they're just a couple inches away from where you're sitting. With a game, you may be playing technically the same thing that other people are playing, but even if it's like a visual novel, you are not hitting A at the same time as everybody else. You're not reading things, you're not processing things in the same way as everybody else. And with games, there's always the possibility that everything you're doing can just fall apart at any given moment, and that's the same experience with theater. All of it could just go kaput at any point. You could throw something at the people on stage, or one of them could slip independently of you, but there is a very direct relationship with the audience and with the art that's actually happening. There's a kind of direct input. You do not get that with films. The film exists independently of you as a viewer. Everyone experiences things differently because cognition is different, blah, 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 whatever the fuck. Same thing with music, same thing with TV, but games and theater, you both experience in a kind of live way, in a kind of tandem with the artist itself. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Games and theater are the same.
I really love that.
That's a great analysis, especially since like theater, it's been so long, but like especially since a lot of theater, it requires a ton of audience participation too. So that affects whatever happens on stage. So I lost my train of thought. That was what I meant to say. Audience participation.
I really love this. Have you guys seen Past Lives from this year or from last year?
No.
Do you know of it?
Yeah.
You want to?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, I was responding to both of you. Kameron, you should definitely see it. Tyler, you should definitely learn about it and then also see it. It is, in my opinion, if not the best film, top 2 probably. I'm still wrestling with some recent things I've seen, but the story of the film, and I'm going to be real quick about this, is about a Korean woman who immigrates to America early on, but not before she has sort of a schoolgirl crush with this boy back in Korea. Her family leaves, goes to Canada, and then to New York, and he stays in Korea. And then the story picks up at 3 points in their lives. That time when they're kids, about 14 years later in like young adulthood, and then another like 8 or 9 years after that when she's actually married to just a white American man, and her like schoolgirl crush comes back or visits her in New York. And this is why I love the movie so much, because I think it's very specific, but it's basically this exploration of grieving a love that you never really got to experience. And the really real emotions that this woman grapples with, and the performance by Greta Lee is just beyond. But it's no doubt, in large part, the character she plays is based on the filmmaker Celine Song, a Korean-American playwright. And she was working on a production of The Seagull, That's Chekhov, right?
Yeah.
In 2019, that was supposed to open up in New York, but the pandemic happened, and so she found a way of doing that production during the pandemic. And do you want to take it? What she did is she staged it inside of a video game. And would you like to take a guess as to what video game she did this play in?
I just read it. Cameron, you should guess.
Final Fantasy 14?
I fucking wish it was Final Fantasy 14. No, The Sims 4.
Oh shit.
She did it inside of The Sims 4, casting real actors and having them play their characters like in The Sims. And I just think that is absolutely in line with with Tyler's thesis point here.
That's the future right there. That's the future of theater.
Some of our friends are rolling in their not yet graves.
Fuck them, we're right.
I mean, you had like Machinima with like red versus blue, so that could be that for like film and television, and then this idea would be for like theater.
Going back to Sony's marketing team, they also wanted to target folks who were into RPGs in the first place, i.e., the folks who were playing 16-bit games on the SNES. There was a decent install base that they could snatch up when it became apparent that the N64 did not have anything to offer in terms of RPGs. Like, literally nothing. At this point, we didn't even have Quest 64 yet. One creative marketing brief reads, the subtext of the campaign should be, the N64 isn't ready for the creator's imagination, which is pretty wild. I think that's a very bold statement.
That is a dig.
They were throwing hands.
Then there were the TV ads. Did you guys see these when they were on back in the day? I mean, we would have been like 6 or 7.
Possibly.
No, I don't remember them at all.
I don't remember them. They contain no gameplay, of course, and they are absolute cheese fests now. But at the time, the idea of a grand epic that you could play in 3D with motorcycles and monsters and rockets and girls wasn't really the kind of thing that you saw in game advertisements, because a lot of that wasn't really in games at the time. These ads really took it seriously. Again, it felt like a movie. It felt like the summer blockbuster, or really more like the winter blockbuster. I think FF7 for the Western market came out closer to Christmas, or like November. But there was a grandiosity to the campaign that was hitherto unmatched in gaming. This I found really interesting. The idea to de-emphasize the RPG part was a move that was made by Squaresoft, not by Sony. See, there was some chatter going around with Square USA that if Final Fantasy VII failed, the 6-game deal did not matter. Square USA was going to shut down operations. Ooh. So the 6-game deal might continue on in Japan, but once again, this was the Final Fantasy, again going back to the origins of the original game's title. If this didn't work out and work out huge for them, basically everyone was boned. Aspects of the marketing in the West went through Sakaguchi himself as well. The international success was coordinated, and while we can all agree it's a fantastic game at the core of it all, or at least I think the three of us can agree, other people might feel differently, it would be an outright lie to say that the game would have been as influential as it was were it not for the amount of effort from all sides that went into the specifically Western marketing. It would have sold well in Japan regardless, but in the U.S. territory, they really hit it hard. FF7 started being advertised in the West around the same time as its Japanese release, where it sold 2 million copies in 3 days. That's what I mean by it would have succeeded in Japan no matter what.
Oh my god.
It's a lot.
Was that every person on the island playing Final Fantasy
what was the population of Japan in 1997?
Yeah, let's find out. It's going to be way bigger than that.
Okay, no, it's 126 million. So, still a lot. But still, when you look at it, that's 1 or 2%, 1.5% of the country bought Final Fantasy VII within a few days of its release.
Yes.
That's It's still kind of a lot.
That's the kind of monocultural event that does not happen anymore anywhere.
And you hear about like Dragon Quest always gets released on weekends because people take the day off from work when it gets released. I don't know if that's true. That's just something I've heard around.
I've
before,
heard that too. I believe it.
I suspect Final Fantasy is kind of much the same. A new game comes out in Japan and people buy it right away. And people do it in the West too, especially now. But by the time it came out on... Oh, I was wrong about the Christmas release time. By the time it came out on September 7th, 1997 in the US, an audience hungry for the next big innovation in storytelling came out of the woodwork.
What? Are you trying to tell me that on the very same weekend that Fire Down Below, the Steven Seagal movie with country rock superstar Travis Tritt in a supporting role, topped the American box office, that audiences were hungry for innovation in storytelling? I don't believe it.
It was actually a Steven Seagal movie was the top movie. I didn't know he was ever actually that popular.
Dude, yeah, in there we could do a whole podcast series on the heights of Steven Seagal's like late 80s, early 90s career.
You know, it's funny that you looked this up, Jacob, because I actually looked up in preparation for you asking this question or bringing up what movie was the top of the box office, but I looked up the Japanese release instead of the US release, and I was ready to answer your question with Jerry Maguire. I was I thought I was going to be like prepared for it, and then and then it's like, oh no, we're doing the American release, because of course we are.
Now, we should say, though, the sales were not as hot in America, but it made it up to 1 million copies in 2 months, becoming the first PlayStation title in the US to hit that milestone. So we're talking about different markets and sort of different targets here, but word grew, and the title would eventually grow to be the second highest selling title on the console overall, topping out at 10,022,228 copies sold worldwide. Wow. So number 2.
God.
Now here's my question. Do you guys know what number 1 is?
I do not.
Take some guesses.
I do want to take a guess. It's going to be a pre-guess, because my first thought would be Metal Gear Solid, but you here saying that it's not what we're expecting is trying to make me think of something else.
I mean, maybe it is what you guys... It wasn't what I was expecting.
I'm going to throw out... Okay, I'm gonna walk through this.
Take us on a journey.
Yeah, bring us on Game Facts, baby. Give me that walkthrough.
It's not something Tyler was expecting. And so I'm thinking the story here has got to be a genre that Tyler doesn't really play, which would make sense if it's going to be the highest selling game on the PlayStation. It can't be some niche treasure. So with some reflection, I think it is Gran Turismo 2.
Oh, you're so close. Take one more guess.
Is it the first one? Is it Gran Turismo?
Yes, it's Gran Turismo 1.
Wow. God damn it! It was Gran Turismo 1.
I was really surprised that I know Gran Turismo is popular, but I didn't realize like more popular than Final Fantasy VII popular. The praise was unanimous. Final Fantasy VII was a critical and commercial darling, quickly being deemed by many, even in this early stage of its release cycle, as the greatest game ever made. So what is it like to actually play the damn thing? Well, we're going to talk about it on the next episode of Mike's and Memory Cards. That's right, it's a multi-parter. Ow, fuck.
Thanks again for joining us for another episode of Mike's and Memory Cards. Please join us again next week, where we go into some of our personal experiences with Final Fantasy VII, get into some specifics about the lore, and there's a lot more to uncover here. In the meantime, I'm Jacob.
I'm Tyler.
And I'm Kameron.
And you've been listening to Mike's and Memory Cards.